What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Deku story. What if Deku was abandoned by heroes and raised by a succubus queen? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. 11 years ago. A young girl, about the age of 5 was running through the forest as fast as she could. Her long green curls filled with leaves as she clutched a large egg to her chest. She looked back behind her with wide emerald eyes as she ran, seeing a large wolf-like demon running after her. She felt her tears fall from her eyes as she continued to push on through the trees and uphill. The mountains, she cried out as she ran up a slope, kicking off a rock to jump to a next one. She looked back as the demon got closer to her, and she cried out in horror as she dove away from its snapping jaws. She went rolling down the slope, clutching the egg to her chest tightly to protect it. She groaned as she came to a stop, and looked up at the valley she was in. Gotta run, she cried out as she pushed herself up, but felt her long green dress snag on a bush. She yanked on it furiously, trying to free herself, before she heard the dark growling of the beast that had been chasing her. She looked up in horror to see it slowly approaching her while she was trapped. Ow, no, she cried out as she yanked on her dress. Help, she cried out, her tears falling down her cheeks as she tried to free herself. The demon growled at her, before launching itself in her direction. Her eyes widened before she clutched the egg closely to her chest. She needed to protect the precious item, dragon eggs were rare after all. She sobbed out as the demon opened its jaws, and saw the many sharp teeth inside its mouth. She screamed out, crouching down to protect the egg, before she heard a loud explosion from the side. She looked up to see someone crashing into the demon. It was a boy her age with ash blonde hair and large ruby-red eyes that were glaring at the demon. He put his hand on the demon's face, and she saw a bracelet with red jewels on it glow, before he set off an explosion, and the demon was blasted back into the forest. Wah! She looked up at the boy as he landed on the ground in front of her. She recognized the tribal attire of the mountain people, the dark baggy pants, no shirt. He was wearing tribal jewelry, many beaded necklaces all around his neck, and the beaded bracelets he had around both his wrists. She gulped as the boy glared back at her with his big ruby eyes. Run, idiot, he shouted back at her, and she clutched the egg to her chest, before she looked at her dress. The boy grunted in anger as he reached down and tore the fabric to free he. Go, he shouted at her, and pointed towards the valley. But what about you? She asked him as she got up and he smirked at her. I'll be fine, I saved your ass didn't I? He said with his toothy grin, before they heard the snarls of the demon. The two children looked back as it jumped out of the bushes at them, its jaws opened wide. The boy growled out in anger, turning towards his opponent with his hands opened wide. Get out of here, I'll kill this thing. He shouted at her before he jumped at the demon, blasting off the ground with the use of what she assumed was his quirk. She watched as he clashed with the wolf-like monster, blasting it in the face with his exploding palms. I can't just. She looked down at the egg in her arms, and then up at the boy. She felt a nervous sweat on her cheek, before looking at her town dress. She grabbed the hem of it, and ripped the fabric off all around her, till it was above her knees. She made a sling around her body, and tied the egg tight against her, before she looked around for something to use to attack with. Ow! She looked up in horror to see the boy thrown back against a tree, and clutching his arms. They looked like they were throbbing with pain and her eyes went wide as the demon approached him. Tisk! Like I'll let some fucking monster get me, he said with a growl as he glared at the demon. No! Izuku cried out as the demon lunged at the boy. She started running towards it, her tears of fear flying off her face. She looked at the ground, and spotted a large tree branch. She reached down and grabbed it with her small hands as she ran towards the demon that the boy was fighting off. He had his hands on its open mouth, trying to hold it back from biting down on him. Get away from him, she screamed out as she jumped up over a bush and swung the branch back. The boy looked up at her in shock, as the branch started to glow a faint green like her arms. She swung with all her power, and smashed the branch into the side of the demon's head. She watched as the demon went flying from her blow and she landed with a thunk on the ground, using her arms to brace herself so she wouldn't crush the egg. What the fuck are you doing? The boy shouted at her and she looked up at him as he glared down at her. You're going to get yourself killed. So are you. She shouted back at him, and he growled out in anger before he reached out and grabbed her by the arm. He pulled her up to her feet, and she let out a groan as she dropped the branch she was holding. "Huh, I've never done that before. My arm hurts," she said as she looked at her hands. "There's no time to worry about that." The boy shouted at her and he pulled her into a run. She followed after him, considering he was still holding onto her wrist. She looked up at the back of his head as they ran. "What the fuck is a stupid girl like you doing out here anyways? You're not from the mountains." I'm from a village nearby in the forest," she told him as they ran, trying to keep up with him. I didn't know there was a mountain tribe nearby. Fuck." She saw him look back behind him and she blinked in surprise and turned her head to look behind her as well. She saw the demon running after them, snarling in anger as they broke out into the rocky valley. "That thing just won't die." He slid to a stop and pulled her behind him. She looked up at the back of his head nervously as he held his hands out. "Stay behind me. I'm going to kill this fucking thing." "Wait," she cried out and he looked back at her, a look of annoyance on his face. "We keep hitting it in the wrong spots," she told him in a panic. "We have to wait for its mouth to be open. No matter how many times you blast it in the fur it's fine, and there's no damage from when I hit it. We don't have time to talk." He shouted at her, and grabbed her by the arm as he pulled her out of the way while the demon dove at them. She hit the ground with him as they rolled, and she looked up to see the boy getting up. "How the fuck am I supposed to blast him in the mouth without getting my arm chopped off?" "I have an idea," she said nervously, and she pushed herself up too. "I'll distract it. That's how you fucking die. Do you want to die?" The boy snapped at her and she ground her teeth together, her tears dripping down her cheeks. "No. That's why we've got to do this." She looked at him nervously, before she pulled a pair of white gloves out of a pocket on her dress. She pulled them on her hands, and clenched her fists tightly, making them glow green. "Mom says I shouldn't use these. But now is not the time to think about that. You're not thinking at all." The boy shouted at her, and she laughed a bit, before she the egg off herself and set it down on the rocks gently. "But I am," she shouted, before she took off at a run. "Get him in the mouth when I say," she shouted back at the boy who watched her in disbelief as she ran head on towards the demon. She narrowed her eyes at it, as it took a run at her. She looked up as it jumped into the air to pounce on her, and she ground her teeth together as she slid to a stop in the rocks, before she lifted her hands up. The demon opened its mouth, ready to eat her, but she reached out with her glowing green hands, and grabbed both parts of its open mouth, and groaned as the demon slammed her back into the rocks. "Now!" she screamed out as she held the demon's mouth open. She heard explosions from behind her, and looked up to see him glaring at the demon as he came in hot. He reached his hand out, pointing his palm up into the open mouth of the demon, before he let off a powerful explosion into its throat. The girl cried out in surprise as the demon was blasted out of her hands. She held them in front of her face to block the bits of it that exploded everywhere, before she felt something fall on her stomach. "Oof." She opened her eyes, groaning in pain as she looked at the boy who had fallen on top of her, and he pushed himself up, grumbling as he looked over at the bits of demon that disappeared in black smoke all around them. "Huh. Good job," she said with a smile to him, and he snapped his head to look at her, anger in his eyes. "I could have fucking done that on my own," he shouted at her, and her smile turned into a nervous one as he got up off of her. He let out a grunt as he glared down at her, before grabbing her by the arm and pulling her to her feet. "Idiot, the fuck kind of quirk is that?" Izuku felt a nervous sweat trickle down her cheek as she looked up at him, before she pulled her gloves off her hands. "Just a strength 1. I can use it on objects in my hand. Or with these gloves." She pocketed them and looked up at him as he glared at her. "Yours. It's pretty cool. I noticed your bracelets were glowing when you used it." She pointed at his wrists. "I've never seen anything like that before, it's so amazing." HMPH, the boy looked away from her, his cheeks turning a little pink. "Of course it's amazing. The egg," she shouted, cutting him off. He looked at her with wide angry eyes as she ran off towards the egg she left on the ground. She dropped to her knees beside it, and sighed out with relief to see it was all right. "Thank God. The fuck is that? A dragon egg?" The boy snapped from behind her, surprising her. She looked up at him nervously. "What the hell are you doing with something like that?" "I found it," she said with a frown as she stood up with the egg. The other day I was looking for herbs for the village. And I found this egg around here. She looked up at the boy. I couldn't find a nest or anything, so I took it back home. But my mom says I can't keep it. Of course not, idiot. That thing would burn down the forest you live in. He snapped at her as he took the egg into his hands. This is a fire dragon egg. Really? The girl asked curiously as she looked at it. He looked at her with annoyance, before pointing at the red specks all over it that shone like rubies in the sun. Yeah, the specks give it away, moron. My tribe has a few of these guys, they take a lot of hard work to train, there's no way you could do it. He growled out and looked down at her. Oh. The girl frowned sadly, but it quickly turned into a smile as he looked up at him. Then, maybe you could look after it for me. I know these are rare, I was trying to bring it out here so it could hatch in the mountains. Fucking forest people, he snapped as he looked at her, before he turned away and growled. I'll fucking take it then. Thanks. The girl smiled warmly at him and he looked back at her. By the way, I didn't get a chance to introduce myself because of that demon. I'm Izuku. She pointed at herself with her finger, grinning brightly. What's your name? Katsuki. He growled out to her, and quickly looked away. What a pretty name, she said happily to him as he sat down on a rock and looked the egg over. What are you doing? Don't call boys names pretty. He snapped and looked up at her, before looking down at the egg in its hands. Usually you can tell when it's close to hatching. I'd say this has about a week before it comes out. Wow. Izuku crouched in front of him, and looked at the egg in his hands with a warm smile. I wish I could see that. You can. The boy grumbled out as he looked down at her. My tribe is very close by. I assume you're in that village that's not far from here. He grumbled out and looked down at the egg again. Really? She looked up at him with wide eyes. So. Can I come out here to see it then? That's what I was saying, moron. He looked down at her and grumbled. Jut, don't get fucking Almont eaten by a demon again. We can meet here. He waved a hand at the small valley they were in, just on the edge of the mountainous region. He looked back down at her as she smiled brightly up at him and he growled out. Stop smiling like that. Are you stupid or something? Sorry. She said with a nervous laugh and stood up. I'm just, really excited. She told him, and looked at the egg. I can't wait. Over the next several days, the girl would leave her village in the forest to meet the boy from the mountains. They would sit and talk about quirks they had seen, and the boy would tell her all about living in the mountains. He was always surprised to see how fascinated she was by his stories, and she would write the out in a notebook she brought with her. Why the hell are you always writing in that stupid book? He asked her in annoyance as she scribbled more information down about dragons. It was the 6th day since they met, and he was always curious of her strange habits. I want to become a hero one day and travel the world. She told him happily, and smiled up at his surprised face. I want to see everywhere, and meet lots of people. I want everyone to know my name, and I want to save people from demons, like how you did the other day. You helped. He told her bluntly, looking at her curiously. Yeah, but I almost died before you showed up. I was so happy you did. She told him with a bright grin. I think you'd make a great hero too. Tisk, the boy looked away from her. I don't want to be no fucking lame hero. He told her as he looked at the leg in his lap. Katsuki was sitting beside Izuku on the ground as she lay on her stomach. I'm going to be king of the mountain tribes one day. Then the whole world. The whole world. Izuku asked him and looked at him curiously. Yeah. I want the power to obliterate all those stupid fucking demons. He looked down at her with his sharp ruby red eyes. And I'll do that with my own power. He looked up at the sky now. Then I'll take the throne from the king, and become the ultimate power in the land. That's a pretty big dream. Especially without the sword from the legend. Izuku said with a thought and she looked up at the sky too, before looking back at him. But, I think you can do it. Moron, of course I'll do it. He snapped at her, before he felt the egg shift in his lap. Ah, is it? She pushed herself up onto her knees and looked at the egg as it jiggled in his lap. It's hatching, he said with a panicked look on his face. It's okay. I've got the notes, she shouted as she held up her book and he looked at her incredulously. The notes I gave you, he told her in a grumbled and watched her smile nervously. Well here. She pulled something out of a yellow bag she brought with her every day and he saw it was a blanket. She folded it up on the ground and he placed the egg on it. This is so exciting, Kachan. Geez, what a stupid fucking name. He grumbled out at her, and she laughed before the egg jiggled some more. Oh. She grabbed his hand and gripped it tightly. It's hatching, she said excitedly as some cracks appeared. She lowered her head to watch it with interest before she felt him tug on her hand. Don't sit so close, they sometimes breath fire when they hatch. Katsuki looked at her with angry eyes. Haha, alright. She smiled up at him and he grumbled out in anger and looked back at the egg. Here it comes, he said as they watched for a long half an hour. The shell finally broke apart, and a small red leathery creature tumbled out of it. Its shell is stuck on its head, she said worriedly and went to pull it off. Idiot, don't. Katsuki grabbed her other hand and pulled it back. Let it do that by itself, they're smart. He told her as he looked her in the eyes, before they both looked back at the dragon. They watched it stumble a bit, before the shell went blasting off from a stream of flames the tiny creature let out. See, smart, and fire. He said with a sigh. It's so cute. She gushed out happily as the dragon looked around at its surroundings, before it turned its head to look up at the both of them at the same time. Shit. Katsuki grumbled out as he watched the dragon look back and forth between them. I forgot. The first person they see is the one they imprint on. Imprint? Izuku asked worriedly and he grumbled. The one it thinks is its mom. He told her in a grunt as the dragon continued to look at them. But it's seeing two people. I don't know what will happen. Izuku looked at the creature nervously as it sniffed her knees, before sniffing Katsuki's. She gripped both his hands tightly as she watched it eye them both up, before it climbed up onto Katsuki's legs and sniffed at their hands. It looked at her, then at Katsuki once more, before it jumped up onto his shoulder and settled there, sniffing his hair. Haha. I think it chose you. Izuku said with a bright smile. That's great. Well yeah, considering it can't live with you. Katsuki sighed out as he touched the dragon that settled around his neck. He looked back at her as she watched it with excited eyes. But it's probably going to think you're an important person, so I wouldn't worry about it liking you. He told her before pulling his hands from hers. He touched the dragon along its back, and it let out a purring-like sound. The fuck should we name it? Baku. Izuku said happily and he looked at her in confusion. That's part of your tribe name, right? Let's name him Baku. Good enough. He grumbled out as he looked at the dragon and went to stand up. I guess I should head home. Izuku said with a sigh as she collected her things. Katsuki watched her with interest as she shoved the stuff back into that ridiculous yellow bag she had. I'll come by again sometime. Well, tell me when, moron. He told her with a grunt. So I can be here. How about in 5 days? She asked him, and grinned. At noon. Fine, see you then. He told her with a grunt. Don't die on your way. I won't. She called out to him before she took off back home. 5 days later, Izuku packed up some snacks into her bag along with her notebook. She ran for the door, making sure she had her gloves in her pocket. Izuku, are you going out again? Her mother Inko called out to her from the kitchen. Yeah, I'm gonna go meet Kachan again. She shouted out with a smile. I'll be home for dinner. Be careful of demons. Inko shouted out after her daughter. Izuku took off at a run through the forest, a bright smile plastered on her face. She was excited to see the growth of the dragon after the days they had spent apart. She continued running, seeing the break in the trees ahead of her. She felt her heart pounding happily as she leapt out over a bush, before her eyes widened in horror. She slid to a stop in the dirt as she looked out at 4 demons that looked like the one from the other day. She felt her heart stop in her chest as they all turned to snarl in her direction. Catch. She choked on her words as she looked around for him. He was always here first. These demons get him. She saw no trace of him, and she felt her eyes water as the demons approached her. Kachan. She choked out, her legs freezing up. There was no way she could win against 4 demons. She barely survived the last one. She let out a scream as the demons shot towards her, and she ran towards the cliff. Izuku. She heard her name from the air, and looked up to see him dropping out of the air towards the demons. Her eyes widened as she saw the dragon was at least 5 feet long now, much bigger than both the children. What did I say about almost getting eaten? He shouted at her as he landed with a band on one demon. He pried its mouth open with his hand and blasted it in the mouth. They were here when I got here. She shouted as she ran away from the two that continued to chase her while one went after Katsuki. Run. Gotta run, she cried out, before a demon launched itself at her. She screamed out as she was pounced upon, and looked up at the horrible open mouth of the demon that bared down on her. Kachan. Izuku. He shouted out at her, and they both heard an ear-piercing screech about their heads. Izuku looked up at the dragon, Baku, as it swept down over the demon and ripped it off her with its claws. It tossed the demon to the side as Katsuki came running in her direction. Get up. Run. I hurt my leg. She cried out, seeing the claw marks from the demon that pounced on her. She looked up at the other one that was coming in on her. She yanked her gloves out of her pocket, and pulled one on in time to catch its mouth in time, but its teeth sunk into her other hand. She bit back her cries of pain as Katsuki slid in next to her, and blasted his hand into the demon's mouth. He looked down at her, huffing for breath as she clutched her bleeding hand to her chest. Get up, he shouted at her as he grabbed her by the arm and pulled it around his shoulder. Baku, he shouted at the dragon as it did away with the demon from earlier. Get the last one, he shouted, pointing at the last demon that was coming towards them. Katsuki gripped Izuku's arm tightly as the demon leapt at them, its jaws open. Baku would be too late. And now, Izuku cried out as she reached her gloved hand out and grabbed the demon by its upper mouth. Katsuki looked at her with wide eyes, before he stuck his hand out into the throat of the demon and blasted it with his quirk. The two children let out sighs of relief as the black mist of the demons' bodies disappeared. That was scary. Izuku cried out from beside him, and he looked down at her. She held open her bleeding hand, and looked at it worriedly. Your hand. Katsuki sat her down on a rock and looked at the opened wound. It's all right, she said with a laugh as she looked at him. His angry red eyes snapped to look up at her emerald ones. It's not all right, he said with a growl, and he grabbed a flask off his hip and dumped the water over her wound. She bit back her tears of pain as the water washed away most of the blood. It's not too deep. He looked at the bite mark on her palm, before he brought it up to his mouth. Izuku blushed a bright red as she felt his tongue lick over her wound, and she tried to jerk her hand from his, but he glared at her in anger. What are you doing? She cried out, her whole face red. Disinfecting, he told her with annoyance in his eyes. Now hold still, he told her before he opened up her bag she had let drop on the ground. You always have crap in here. He pulled out a roll of cloth. Figures you have bandages, he said before he ripped some off and wrapped it around her hand for her. There, let's see your leg. He lifted her leg now, but she jerked it out of his grasp. It's all right, she said in a panic, not sure she could stand watching him lick her leg. Let me see it, he growled out at her, and Izuku shook nervously before he grabbed her ankle and yanked on it. He looked down at it and sighed. It's just a scrape, you'll be okay, he said as he dumped water on it and wrapped it up. Idiot, how do you get into so much danger? I don't know. I've never seen so many demons here before, Izuku said with a frown as she looked down at him. Neither have we. He glared at the ground as Baku came up beside him when he stood up. Which is why my tribe is moving. He looked back at her and she felt a pain in her chest. What? She asked nervously, and her eyes widened as he looked away from her. Why you mean, we can't see each other anymore, he told her with a grunt. Oh, Izuku felt tears well in her eyes and he looked back at her. That is, she felt her tears fall down her cheeks as she looked at the ground. I'm sad, I'll miss you, idiot, she looked up at him as he grabbed her face and rubbed her tears away with his rough fingers. I brought you something, he told her with a grunt as he reached up to his ear. She looked up at the many earrings he wore, and he took a red bead one off the top of his ear. There's a tradition in my tribe, if you want to be with someone forever, you give them an earring. He looked down at her. This way, we'll see each other again someday. But, I don't have any holes in my ear, she sobbed out as she tried to dry her tears. I know, so this is going to hurt. He looked away from her with a grumble, before looking back. What? She looked up at him with a shocked expression. I'm gonna put it in your ear. Only we can take them off, so this way you'll never lose it. He told her as he leaned close to her and looked at her ear. I'll put it on the top, okay. It's gonna hurt, but not a lot. Izuku blushed as she felt a few more tears fall down her cheeks. All right, she said in a small voice, and she looked at him. He looked back at her for a moment, before looking to her ear. He touched the top part of them, and she felt her cheeks grow hotter as his fingers tickled her skin. There was a sharp pain and a click. Ouch, I said it was gonna hurt. He sighed out as he stood up and Izuku touched her ear as it burned hot. There, this way we're guaranteed to meet again. Really? She looked up at him and he let out a growl of annoyance. Why would I lie about that crap? He asked her, looking away before he looked back down at her. He jumped in a panic as he saw her sobbing into her hands. Why are you still crying? Because I'm still going to miss you. I've never had a friend before. She told him through her tears. Idiot, you'll be fine, he told her as he wiped her tears away from her cheeks again. I'll come back to see you, alright? You promise? She sobbed out, and wiped at her cheeks. I promise, Katsuki told her, and pressed his forehead to hers. Present day, Izuku had grown into a beautiful 16-year-old girl, her dark green curls long, and freckles on her face from being in the sun. She was out in the forest gathering herbs for her small village, and she looked out at the trees fondly as she remembered the days from her childhood, and the mountain tribe boy named Katsuki. She hadn't seen him since that day, and the threat of demons in the mountains was growing due to how close they were to the Badlands. She looked towards the direction of the valley she used to spend time with him in, and wondered if he was doing all right. Her fingers went up to the earring on the top of her right ear that was hidden by her curls. The ruby color reminded her of his eyes, and she felt her cheeks heat up a bit. Liar, she sighed out as she knelt down to pick some herbs. When do you plan on coming back, huh? She sighed out as she gathered the herbs into a basket. She hurried back to her village, and entered her house. Her mother was busy boiling some herbs on the fire. I'm back, Mom. Izu dear, thank you. Her mother smiled at her as she took the herbs. Thank you, with your father gone, you're truly a lifesaver. Can we talk about it now? Izuku looked up at her mother who looked back at her. About my wanting to be a hero. Sweetie, I know you want to see the world, but it's so dangerous out there. Her mother frowned as she sorted the herbs. I don't want to lose you too. But Mom, it's my dream. Izuku said with a sigh. I want to see the world. And find that boy. Her mother asked and Izuku's cheeks heated up to a bright red. That's not the only reason. She grumbled out as she rested her head on the table. I still don't approve. You don't even have a weapon other than your gloves. Inko looked back at her daughter worriedly. And it's a long way to the nearest city. Geez. Izuku groaned out as she reached in her pocket and gripped the pair of gloves in there. I could do it. I've defeated demons before. With help, not by yourself. Inko turned back to the stove and Izuku sighed as she sat back up. I'm going to go outside, she said with a grumble as she headed to her room. She removed her dress, and pulled on a pair of trousers before she went outside. She looked up as she pulled her gloves onto her hands, and eyes up the makeshift dummy she had made to practice on. She clenched her fists, letting them glow green before she began throwing punches at the dummy. Izu, make sure you don't hurt your hands again. Her mother called out and Izuku let out a groan of annoyance. I'm fine, she started to yell back at her mother before she heard a loud boom from the village. She looked up as she saw flames rising above the rooftops and screams. What? Izu, get inside. Her mother shouted out the window, but Izuku clenched her fists and ran towards the flames quickly. Izuku, someone might be hurt. She shouted out as she ran to the village they lived on the outskirts of. She looked around as she saw flames roaring on the rooftops of some homes. Her eyes widened in horror as she rounded around a building, and looked up to see a massive humanoid-like creature. It had horns and leathery skin and wings. She shook a bit with fear as she saw it clutching some children in its claws. People ran away screaming, looking for weapons of some kind as the demon raged and destroyed some buildings. This was a type of demon she had never seen before. Someone, my children, one of the lades she knew well in the village cried out, before the demon smashed another building. Izuku's eyes looked to the blood that spilled everywhere, and she clenched her fists tightly as she looked up at the demon, glaring. She kicked off the ground at a run. There was no time to think, she had to save the kids. Good thing I bought these shoes, she said as she ran. The red boots she wore glowed a soft green, utilizing the quirk she had to power her speed a bit more. I'm coming, she shouted loudly as she ran past a burning building and some people running away screaming. She looked up at the clawed hand the children were in, and then up at the demon. She had to make it let go. She screamed loudly up at the demon and it looked to her as she grabbed a pitchfork from the ground. Let go of them. I'm much tastier, she shouted as she hucked the pitchfork at the demon with all her strength. She watched it impale the demon's eye and she dove with her arms stretched out to catch the kids that fell. She slid to a stop on the ground, before spilling across it in a roll. She let them go and they ran off towards the mother as Izuku pushed herself up off the ground. She whipped her head around to look up at the demon, and clenched her fists tightly as it turned to screech at her. She dove out of the way of its claws, and scrambled to her feet. She looked up to see the edge of the village. She had to lead it away. It was angry at her now. She made a run for it, and could hear the demon chasing after her. She broke into the tree line, grinding her teeth together. It was better her than any more people. She looked back as a tree came crashing her way and she dove to the side, gasping as she tried to catch her breath. She pushed herself up, but felt something grab her around the middle. The breath she caught was squeezed out of her as the demon picked her up, and she looked back at it with wide eyes as it screeched at her. This was her final moments. She'd never see the mountain boy again. Do not fear. She heard a booming laugh, followed by an actual boom and gust of wind. She looked away from the demon towards a large man who was about 10 feet away. For Amheeree. He shouted with another laugh, and she saw the glint of metal as the man drew a sword. She groaned out as the demon squeezed her, reaching out to attack the newcomer, but the man swung the sword, and Izuku held up her hand to stop the shining golden light from blinding her. He swung it in a great arch, before a loud blast came off the blade. She watched as the attack cut right through the large demon that had her, and it screeched out its dying breath, before turning into black mist. Izuku groaned as she fell to the ground, expecting a bone-crushing landing, but instead someone had caught her. My, sorry about that. The man laughed loudly and she looked up at the huge person as he set her down on her feet. I bet that must have been scary. I heard this area has been having a lot of trouble with demons lately, so I came to take a look personally. Izuku looked up at the bulky muscle of the man, and saw he wore a regal red coat and blue trousers. A grin was plastered on his face, and he sheathed the sword on his back. He looked down at her, and saw his hair was golden, and his bangs were in a distinctive V-shape. She felt realization click in her head. She had heard the stories of the king of the world, how he was impossibly massive for a human, and had that distinctive hair. How his laugh was like thunder, and his presence was hard to miss. Why she stuttered out, raising a shaking finger. The king of the world. His Highness. All Might. Wahahaha. So my reputation precedes me even out here. The man laughed loudly as she fell back on her bottom in shock. Yes, my dear girl. I am. But I'm on a mission, you see. I need to make it to the UA Guild here in this region, but I got a bit lost. The UA Guild? Izuku asked in surprise. She knew that name too from her research. She had always wanted to adventure there to become a hero. Yes. But then I happened upon this village, and well, I saw a brave young lady running towards a demon without a weapon. The man laughed loudly again as he looked down at her shocked face. That was very daring of you. Are you a hero? No. My mom says I can't be one without a weapon to handle my quirk. Izuku stuttered out as she got up to her feet. Well then, the man laughed loudly, I suppose she's right. But you know, the world needs more heroes out there who run into danger without thinking. Well Izuku looked down at her gloves and bit her lip. I really want to become one, I want to do it no matter what, even if I don't have a weapon. She said as she clenched her fists and looked up at the man. I'll definitely do it. My, how brave. The man laughed before another boom startled them. Izuku looked up at the trees and saw two of the same large demons looming over them. Her eyes went wide before she felt a large hand pull her back out of the way. Stand back, I've got this, he shouted as he drew his sword once again. Izuku looked up at him, as she saw him run towards the demon and swing the blade. He cleaved one of them half with the amazing power from the sword, before the other demon reached a hand out towards him, but King All Might swung his blade again and cut through the third massive demon with ease. Wow! Izuku clenched her fists as she watched him and he turned to look back at her, still grinning. She felt her own smile spread across her face, and she ran towards him. Wow! That was amazing! She shouted happily, "You're so amazing! I want to be like that someday." The king looked down at her as she grinned up at him. "Perhaps. Now, you mentioned your mother won't let you head to the UA guild without a weapon." He asked her curiously and she frowned and nodded her head. He seemed to think that over, before he sheathed his sword again. "Lead me to her." Izuku and the king walked through the village, and she looked around at it with sad eyes as she saw the damage. The village people were already cleaning up the mess, and taking care of the wounded. Izuku frowned as she looked away from the bodies that were pulled from the crushed houses. She had been too late to distract that demon from them. "Does this happen often out here?" he asked her with a frown as he looked around at the village. "It's gotten worse over the years. A few mountain tribes had to move away from the area as well because of the proximity to the Badlands." Izuku sighed out. "Heroes don't come out this far either, which is why I want to become one. I want to travel the world, but also protect it." She clenched her fists tightly. "To keep things like this from happening." "Izuku." The woman from earlier with the children came running and threw her arms around her. "Izuku. Thank you so much for saving my children. I'm so glad you're okay, that was so brave." "It's all right." Izuku smiled at her and hugged her back. "I'm glad that you are all okay." Izuku comforted the woman who sobbed, before she left. "Those children would have died if you didn't step in." All Might spoke to her and Izuku looked up at him curiously. "But you almost did as well." "I had too." Izuku looked away from him as she continued on their path to her house. "My legs started moving before my mind. But in the end I'm glad that happened." Izuku let out a shaky sigh as they came up to her home. "Izuku." Her mother threw the door open, startling both Izuku and All Might as the woman cried hysterically. "You gave a heart attack, running off like that." Sorry mom." Izuku looked at her nervously. "But I saved some of the kids. I had to. So dangerous." The woman cried out loudly and hugged Izuku. She then looked up at All Might who was grinning nervously down at her. "Who is this?" "Oh, this is the man who saved me." Izuku looked up at All Might. "He's the king of the world." All Might. "The king." All Might. Inko looked up at the mountain of a man, and Izuku panicked as her mother fainted right there. "Oh my." All Might laughed loudly as he helped Izuku with her mother into the house. She slowly came back around, and looked up at All Might who sat in a chair that was far too small for him. "What a lovely home. The king of the WWWW world is in our house." Inko stuttered out and Izuku handed her some tea to calm her. "What on earth for?" "Well, when I happened upon the scene of chaos," All Might nodded his head in thanks as Izuku handed him some tea too. "I saw this girl bravely fighting the demons. What a sight." He laughed loudly and Inko shook nervously. "It made me think. You see, I'm on my way to the UA guild. A guild for young heroes to be. I thought to myself, well, why isn't this girl there already?" He laughed again and Inko looked to Izuku before back up at the man. "She said it's because she has no weapon." "Well, I'm here to solve that." "What?" Izuku and Inko asked in confusion at the same time. "I'd like to take the girl with me on my journey. It's not far from here I believe. I think she would make an excellent hero." All Might grinned at them both and Izuku felt her face pale. "But I figured I should ask her mother first." "But, it's so dangerous." The woman stuttered out. "But then again, this is the king of the world." "Mom." Izuku looked to her mother who looked up at her in surprise. "I'd like to go. I've always wanted to be a hero, and now I have a more than safe way of getting there, and maybe getting a weapon suited for my quirk." Izuku held up her fists. "I want to do this." Izuku. Her mother burst out into tears. "I'll miss you. I'll be so lonely. But, I can't stop you now, can I? This opportunity is too good to pass up." "Mom." Izuku hugged her mother tightly and All Might laughed loudly. "I'll make sure she gets a weapon, and that she gets any training she needs to become a proper hero." All Might said with a grin. "Your daughter will be safe with me, I guarantee it." A few hours later, Izuku had packed the things she needed in her big yellow bag, and pulled her hair up into a crown braid around her head. She pulled on a green vest, and some beige trousers to travel in. He made her boots were on tight, before she stepped outside to see the king receiving a map from her mother. Now, I wrote out the directions for you both, but Izuku can read maps very well. Inko told the king, make sure you follow this properly, it shouldn't take long for you to arrive at the guild. Thank you. All Might boomed loudly and they both turned to look at Izuku as she gripped the strap of her bag around her chest. My, what a fine-looking hero. Izuku, be safe. Inko cried out as she hugged her daughter tightly and kissed her cheek. I'll be here if you ever want to come back. Thanks, Mom. Izuku hugged her mother tightly, before she looked up to All Might as he grinned proudly at them both. Let's go, she said with a happy grin before they headed off on their path. All Might handed her the map and she looked at it to make sure they were heading in the right direction. I'm so excited. I can't wait to receive my own weapon, she said excitedly. I wonder what I should get. A knife, an axe, maybe a bow and arrow. But a handheld weapon would be best for my quirk type. How about a sword? All Might asked her and she looked up at him curiously. A sword, I guess. The way you handle yours is so amazing, I want one like it if I go that route. Izuku said happily as she thought about that. How about receiving my sword? The man asked her and Izuku looked up at him in shock now. Your sword, but, she thought about that, and bit her lip. But, how would you fight? And I don't think it's designed for my quirk. Young Izuku. He looked down at her as they walked and let out a booming laugh. I shall explain all to you. They came to an inn along the road, and stopped at it for the evening. The king let out a sigh as they set foot in their room, and looked to Izuku who was still thinking about what he had said earlier. I still don't understand, she said with a thought. You want to give me your sword? She looked up at All Might curiously. Let me explain for a moment. The king said as he unhooked the sheath from his shoulders and set the sword down on the table in the room. There was a boom and the room filled up with steam. Izuku looked around in a panic before it cleared. Her eyes landed on a skeletal man, and she cried out in horror. SSSH. It's me, he said waving his hands around before he bulked back up. Izuku fell back into a chair in shock as she saw this happen, before he shrunk back down to the skeletal form from before. She blinked in surprise as she saw him wipe some blood from his mouth. I don't get it, she said in confusion as she thought everything over. What's going on? This is what I need to explain. He sat down, and she looked at him oddly, seeing the regal clothing he wore early was now all baggy around his tiny form. About 5 years ago, there was an altercation with the demons that came from the Badlands, and I went to confront it. I remember that, Izuku said with wide eyes. A lot of the injured people passed through our village. Yes, it was a great battle, and during that battle, I was injured. He lifted his jacket up to show a horrible scar on his stomach. The demon took a fair chunk out of me in the battle, but I was able to put him down. Because of this wound, it is hard for me to move about without my sword. He looked to the sword in question. And using the sword for too long causes great strain. I was just barely able to make it those few hours till we arrived here. He laughed out and blood spurted from his mouth, shocking Izuku again. Then what are you doing going to the UA Guild? Izuku asked nervously, and why would you ask me to come with you? This seems like a pretty important secret I shouldn't know about. Well, that's the thing. All Might raised a finger and grinned at her. I'm heading to the UA Guild because my time as king of the world is growing shorter. And I need to find a successor to receive my sword. Your sword? Izuku thought back again. I still don't get it. That sword shouldn't work with any other quirk other than yours. What do you mean by giving it to me or someone? I'm sure you heard of the legend of the ancient sword, one for all that the great king wielded. All Might looked at her seriously and she nodded her head. That sword one for all, is a powerful weapon, that can work with anyone's quirk. It can also grant power to those who do not have one, like myself. He smiled at her as she paled. You don't have a quirk? She asked nervously and he nodded his head. But because this sword was passed to me, I was granted with power greater than anyone's from this sword. He looked up at her with those serious eyes again. When I saw you back there, fighting that demon, without a weapon. I saw the brave face of a girl who wanted nothing more than to save lives, and protect her village. He stood up and looked down at her. Izuku Midoriya, I came on this journey to find a worthy successor to receive the legendary sword, one for all. I thought I'd find one at the UA Guild. But instead I found you. Izuku felt tears burning in her eyes as he spoke to her, as she felt an overwhelming feeling in her chest. I would like to bestow this sword upon someone worthy, and I think that you are the most worthy. You protected people without a second thought, and fought bravely. Why, Your Highness? Izuku choked out through her tears as he looked at her so seriously. She put a hand to her mouth to try and stop her sobs. I'll ask you right now. Would you be willing to receive this sword, work to become the next king of the world as the owner of One for All? She felt her whole being shift with the pressure of the question, and she choked back her tears and nodded her head. What kind of reply is that? Yes, sir, she shouted loudly, and her tears flowed down her cheeks. This is such an honor. The honor is mine. I can see within you the need to protect others and fight back those dastardly demons that encroach on us. All Might laughed loudly. I'm proud to have met you. I think you will be a wonderful king. Izuku came to a realization and her head swirled. King, she choked out as she put her hands on her head. Yes, but first, we need to get to the UA Guild. He looked down at her with a broad grin. I can't give you the sword now, because we need to train you up to receive it. But I'm sure by the time we arrive you will be able to handle its strength. That's only a month. Izuku looked up at him with her head still spinning. Is that long enough? Well, you have a pretty strong grasp of how to use your quirk, and you seem like a fit girl. All Might laughed loudly again. I think it should go over just fine. But what about you? She looked from him to the sword then back. If I receive the sword, do not worry about that. All Might patted her on the head and ruffled her hair. I have a sword waiting for me at the guild, one I can use while we get you into fitting shape. This one is so big though. Izuku looked over at the blade. She was only about 148 centimeters in height, and the sword was definitely taller than her. That's the surprising thing about One for All. All Might laughed loudly. It takes on a form fitting to its user. This is so much. Izuku looked into her hands, feeling her head spin again. It's time to sleep, we need to leave early in the morning. All Might grinned at her before he landed down in his own bed. Izuku let out a sigh as she crawled into her bed, and pulled the covers up to her chin. She closed her eyes as she thought about what happened, not completely understanding it all. The king of the world, All Might. He wanted her to receive the legendary sword of power and become the next king. She gripped her blankets as she tried to think back to her happy childhood days like she normally did when trying to sleep. That night, for the first time in years, she dreamt about the mountain tribe boy. Izuku struggled to push a large boulder in front of her. She dug her heels into the ground as she pushed at it, and felt it budge. Put your back into it. All Might boomed loudly behind her with a laugh as she groaned from the strain. She used her quirk with her gloves and boots, as she continued to push against the boulder. Come on. If you get this out of the way it'll be easy walking from here. Raaaaaaaaaah. She cried out as she pushed against the rock, and with a burst of energy she shoved it off the cliff side. She gasped as she collapsed to the ground, trying to catch her breath. That weighed more than you did, she groaned out on the rocky ground as All Might walked up to her. Well, you did great, he said with a laugh as he looked over the edge to see the boulder tumble into the valley below. The pair of them were making their way through the mountains. Their goal was to get to the seaside in the mountain region, and most of their time over the last few weeks had been spent climbing over the treacherous terrain. My, you've come a long way in only a few short weeks. He looked down at her as she pushed herself up. Clearly you've been training for years already. I did my best from books that traveling merchants had, she said as she wiped the sweat and dirt off her forehead. It helps that I lived so close to the mountains too. Well, it shows. All Might laughed as they walked along the cliff. I'd say we'll be there before evening, are you ready? He looked back at her as she stumbled after him and climbed over some rocks. Yes. She grinned brightly up at him as she ran to catch up at him. I'm ready for a bath mostly, she rubbed at her messy curls. She had kept them up in a crown braid, but now it was all just a haphazard mess. Well, you deserve it, you look like a young man. All Might laughed loudly as he looked down at her and she blushed. Do I? She asked, patting at her chest. The clothing she wore certainly flattened out and hid her womanly figure. Well, a young boy to be honest. The man looked at her nervously and she groaned out. But what do appearances matter? They don't. Izuku looked up at King All Might as he laughed loudly. She couldn't help her smile and she looked up at the sky as they walked. I guess you're right, she said thoughtfully, before a large shadow was cast over them. Izuku looked up in surprise with All Might. A demon, he shouted out as he grabbed for his sword. No. Izuku's eyes widened as she saw three large familiar shapes. Those are dragons, she shouted as she pointed up at them. Wow, dragons. She started running so she could look at them for longer. Young Midoriya. She heard the king call out her name and she looked back at him, before her foot slipped. Whaaaaaaa. She screamed loudly as she went sliding down the steep cliff side. She reached out her hands, glad she was still wearing her gloves. She caught her fingers on a rock and gripped it tightly to jerk herself to a stop. She groaned as her arms strained and she reached up on the cliff side to grab another rock. I'm all right, she shouted out as she looked up the cliff. She paled a bit as she saw she had fallen a good 50 feet before she stopped herself. She looked down to see the vast crevice below and felt a nervous sweat on her cheek. See, could I get some help? Don't worry, I'll get you out of there. All Might shouted down at her and she groaned as she felt her hands starting to slip out of her gloves. Hurry, she shouted in a panic. She tried to grip onto the rock tighter but she still felt herself slipping. I can't, hold on. She shouted up, but on the last word her hands slipped off the rock and she screamed out again. Young Midoriya. She heard the shout from above as she plummeted to her death. She heard a call out to the side and saw a girl come diving in after her. Her eyes widened as she saw her wearing a mage outfit and holding onto her hat with one hand and a staff in the other. Sorry about this, she shouted and Izuku's eyes went wide as she smacked her with the staff. Izuku felt her body jerk to a halt, before floating upwards a bit. The girl tapped the staff to her arm and she too stopped in mid-air. Phew, I made it in time. She shouted happily and grinned at her. Wow, you gave me a scare, walking right off the cliff like that. Oh Izuku looked at her nervously as they floated above the abyss below. Thank you so much. I thought I was going to die for sure. No problem. What's a young guy like you doing here by the way? She asked as Izuku reached out to the cliffside and grabbed. I'm not. Izuku went to correct her but she heard a shout from above. Are you all right? She looked up to see All Might looking over the cliff at them with an unknown boy wearing a suit of armor and glasses. I'm okay now. Izuku cried up to him and she looked at the girl. Are you okay? I can't use my quirk for too long, she said as she looked like she was about to throw up. We need to get out of here quick. Crap. Izuku looked at her with worry and then up at the cliff side. They were more than 150 feet in the crevice now. Grab onto me, she said as she looked at the other girl who reached out and grabbed Izuku's arm. Just hold onto it for a little longer. She shouted as she put her feet on a foothold, and kicked off from it. She began running up the cliff side, pushing hard with her legs as she pulled the brunette girl with her. She felt sweat drip on her brow as she kicked up over the edge of the cliff and the boy in armor grabbed her by the arm and pulled the girls over to the safe part that he and All Might were standing on. The other girl let out a gurgle of sickness, before they dropped to the ground. The brunette crawled over to the edge and threw up over it. Urgh. Whoa. Izuku looked back at the girl then up at the boy who pulled them to safety. His armor was shiny and well kept. He adjusted his glasses as he looked down at her. Thanks, Midoriya. All Might ran to her and picked her up in a crushing hug. You need to learn to rein in your passion for knowledge. You almost died. Was it because of the dragons? The boy in the suit of armor asked, waving his arms around. We saw them too as we made our way over here. That's when we noticed you walk off the cliff. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. She looked up at the sky, seeing the dragons were gone now. I really like dragons. Thank you for saving me though. She smiled at the boy and the girl who was getting up from her hurling session. All Might set her back on her feet and she bowed to them. My name is Izuku Midoriya, it's nice to meet you. Tenya Iida, the boy in armor with dark hair said with a grin at her. Ochako Uraraka, the brunette girl said with a bright grin. We are on our way to the UA Hero Guild. The boy said with a smile as he looked to Izuku and All Might. Iida. Izuku tapped her finger on her chin, before thumping her fist into her open palm. From that family of well-known knights. Your quirk allows you to move faster than 10 horses combined with just your legs. She shouted as she looked down at his legs and saw metallic pipes on the back of them. I've heard of them from my village. You're from the capital region. Right you are. Iida shouted loudly with a happy smile, it's good to know my family is so well known. We pride ourselves on being a long line of knights who serve the king of the world. Oh, All Might thunked his fist into his palm now. I see. That's where I know you from. Izuku looked back at the large man with a nervous sweat. I'm sorry. Iida and Uraraka looked up at the man as well. He laughed loudly and put his fists on his hips. Do not fear, for I am him, the king. He laughed loudly and Izuku felt herself pale as the others looked at him with wide eyes. Why your highness? Iida sputtered out and bowed to the king. What an honor to meet the great world king, All Might. Wow, this is crazy. Uraraka shouted. She bowed too. Are you his page or something? She looked to Izuku who shook her head and waved her hand around in a panic. No, this here is my protege. The man laughed loudly, clapping a hand on Izuku's shoulders. I'm taking Midoriya to the UA Guild for some hero training. Wow, that's so amazing. Uraraka shouted with bright eyes filled with admiration. You must really be something. She looked to Izuku who blushed a bit. Not really, she said shyly as the girl beamed at her. I think being personally escorted by the king is a very amazing feat. Iida said with wave of his arms. You must truly have something to be admired. Oh geez. Izuku put her hands over her blushing face. Now, let us continue, young heroes. All Might pointed to the part of the sea they could see from the cliff. We are almost at our destination. So cool. We get to travel with the king no too. Uraraka said happily as the group continued on with their journey. I wonder where those dragons were going. Izuku said with a thought as they walked. The mountain tribes are known for having dragons, so it's probably them using them as transportation. Iida said with a thought as they walked. They've taken to this part of the region due to the hordes of demons coming from the north, so they're probably heading off to other tribes. I heard there was a struggle of the position of tribal king. Uraraka said with a thought and Izuku looked at her with wide eyes. They're probably still sorting that kind of thing out. Wahahaha. All Might said with a loud laugh. Many people of the mountain tribes are strong warriors. It's also interesting to see their quirks at work because of their interesting jewelry. It's amazing how it works. Izuku said with a mutter to herself. I've seen it before. From what I know, they find deposits of precious gems in the caverns all over the mountains, then fashion them into jewelry so they can utilize their quirks without the use of a weapon. They tend to have quirks based off their physical abilities, like their palms or other parts of their bodies. She looked up as they walked along their path and smiled. That combined with their utilization of dragons, they're really amazing. Wow. Uraraka looked over at Izuku with a bright smile. How do you know that much? I'm from the forest region. Izuku beamed brightly at the girl. I lived pretty close to the mountains. My childhood friend is one of the mountain tribe, but I haven't seen him in years. She let out a sigh. That's why I want to become a hero, so I can adventure across the world, maybe run into him again. That's beautiful. Uraraka sobbed out and Izuku looked at her worriedly. It sounds like you really admire this friend of yours. Iida said with a smile at her. Yeah, I do. He's amazing. Izuku let out a happy sigh. I really want to see him again. I hope he's doing all right. They had to move because of the demon threat up north. Such strong ambitions from such a young boy. Iida said with tears of his own. I really admire your spirit. I'm 16. Izuku said with a nervous smile and they looked at her in shock. Do I really look that young? Yeah, I would never have guessed you were our age. Uraraka's voice was full of awe as she looked at Izuku. Maybe it's because you're so small, or all boys in your area this tiny. Oh, I'm not. Izuku started to speak again when All Might let out a booming laugh. We're here, he shouted as they came around the mountain they were walking on. Izuku's eyes widened in amazement as she saw what looked more like a town than a guild. There was a large building sitting close to the shore, and it appeared to be made mostly of glass. Many small buildings surrounded it and it even had docks at its shores. UA Heroes Guild. The place to go for aspiring heroes. WHOOOOOOOOOOA. Izuku shouted in amazement as she took in the sight, before she started running off down the path. That's amazing. They must have had a team of people to make that kind of place, with all kinds of quirks. She looked back at the group as they beamed at her. I can't wait to learn all about them. Let's hurry. She took off at a run and the others followed her quickly. At the fast pace Izuku ran at, they were soon at the gates to the large city that surrounded the UA Guild building. She beamed up at the gates happily as All Might stepped up to the gates and let out a booming laugh. Greetings, for I am here. He boomed loudly at the people watching the gate in the tower. It's His Majesty, the King of the World. One yelled out and the group could hear chattering and loud bangs before the gates started to open. Izuku's eyes lit up with wonder as she looked inside. All Might clapped a hand on her shoulder and she looked up at him with wide eyes. Welcome children, to UA Hero Guild. He boomed happily at them and the small group stepped into the busy city. We shall make our way to the UA building and get you registered with them. Wow, this is crazy. Uraraka looked around with wide eyes like Izuku. I'm from a small village in the central region. My village was small too. Izuku said with her mouth open as she looked around. I've never seen a city before. This kind of place is lively. Everyone's got a job to do and are in a rush. Iida said as he pointed at all the people around them. There were stores with many weapons and armor, some sold special wares for quirks, and others sold food and clothing to fit all kinds of people. One could easily get distracted. Well, look at that. Izuku looked over at a man with the head of a dog who was as tall as All Might. And that guy. She looked around at a man who looked like he was made of wood. This is so cool. Someone got easily distracted. Uraraka said with a happy warm smile as she watched Izuku look around at all the people with interesting quirks. Come now, we should hurry so that you all can get a comfy bed tonight. All Might said with a loud laugh as he led the way towards the UA building, but he was stopped as people started to swarm him with praise and cheers at seeing the king. I think we'll have to go by ourselves. Iida said with a nervous glance towards the king who was grinning nervously from the attention. Let us advance. I'm sure he'll locate you again, Midoriya. Right. Izuku said with a bright smile as she followed after the other two to head towards the building. She looked back at the struggling All Might, and felt a bit bad for leaving him behind, but he gave her a thumbs up over the heads of the people and she smiled a bit. Welcome to UA Heroes Guild. A woman laughed happily as they opened the door. She was scantily clad in a tight corset and what looked like panties. She grinned at the group from behind her mask. We're sure getting a lot of people wanting to join up with us these days. Such youth. She squealed happily as she looked at the three teens. Please fill these out and hand them back. She handed them some paper and pencils, and Izuku looked it over. It was all basic information and some things to fill out about the nature of their quirks. She hurriedly scribbled everything out on the form, before handing it back to the woman. Perfect. Absolutely beautiful, she said happily as she looked it over. Ah, you circled F on here instead of M. Yeah, Izuku said with a nervous smile. That's 'cause I'm a girl. My oh my. The woman looked her over and beamed. I don't know why I didn't notice before. What a cute girl. Girl. Izuku turned around to look at Iida and Uraraka who were looking at her in shock. Yeah, Izuku said nervously. I'm a girl. My hair is just a mess from traveling. She let out a soft laugh as Uraraka stared at her with wide eyes. I see, this makes sense as to why you're so small. Iida said while waving his arms around in the air. I get it now. How could I not notice before? Uraraka shouted in surprise and shocked Izuku and Iida a bit. You have such pretty eyes and long eyelashes. And, she grabbed at Izuku's middle then chest. Yes, definitely there, but you should wear cuter clothes. She looked up at Izuku who was stiff from surprise. It was, just easier to move in. Izuku said with a laugh. Well, here you go. The group turned to look at the woman who greeted them. Your guild passes. She held them out with a bright grin and Izuku took the metal plate from the woman and saw her information stamped on it. My name is Midnight, welcome young heroes to UA. This is so awesome. Uraraka shouted in happiness as they were handed some information packets next. We even get rooms. It looks like we're going to be a part of a big group though. It probably makes organization of heroic acts easier. Iida said with a grin. Group 1A, probably because we're beginner heroes. It says there will be room 20 people. Izuku said with a thought and looked up at Midnight. Have that many people already come? Not yet. Midnight beamed happily. We are going to have some missions for you soon, so check back here after you get settled into your lodgings. Wow. A group of heroes. Izuku thought about that for a moment as they walked across the hall of the guild. I wonder what our group will be like. I hope everyone is nice. Uraraka said excitedly as they walked along a path towards the side of the large class building. I want to make lots of friends while I'm here. It appears we can take classes on how to be proper heroes, a true beginner's group. Iida said with a shout behind them. These will be very helpful on a journey for knowledge. That's so cool. Izuku looked at her package and smiled at it. But, I'm mostly excited about a bath right now, I can't wait. She pumped her fists in the air. Young Midoriya. She turned her head to look up as the king came running towards her. Before you go off to get settled, I'd like to speak with you. Oh, sure. Izuku smiled brightly at the king. She looked at the other two she was with. I'll meet you guys there at the building. All right. Don't take too long. Uraraka shouted at her with a grin before her and Iida took off to go find their lodgings. This way, I have requested a private room. All Might lead the way back into the guild building and Midnight looked up at him with wide eyes. Wow. How's it going, Your Majesty? She said with a bright grin before she looked at Izuku. Oh, is she with you? Yes. All Might grinned at Midnight who smiled back. That's so impressive. I knew I had a good feeling about her. Midnight said brightly before All Might lead Izuku into the guild and down a hallway. They stopped at a door and he knocked softly before entering with her in tow. Ah, Your Majesty. It's a pleasure to see you again. Izuku's eyes went wide as she saw a mouse the size of a child sitting on a couch drinking tea. I've been expecting you for a few months now, but this is good too. Did you get lost? A bit. All Might laughed nervously and Izuku closed the door to the room. I'd like to introduce you to someone who I happened upon on my way though. This is Izuku Midoriya, from the forest region. Oh. The mouse looked over at her and she smiled nervously at him as he smiled. Midoriya, this is the guild master, Nedzu. All Might looked at her with a bright grin before taking a seat. We are close friends, he is aware of my situation, which is why we're here. Oh. Izuku blushed a bright red, before bowing to the mouse. It's a pleasure to meet you. I look forward to your guidance. What a polite girl. The mouse laughed as Izuku stood back up. All Might waved her over to sit down and she gulped as she took her seat. So, Your Majesty. Is this the heir you have chosen then? Yes, I happened upon her village on my journey. All Might grinned as he removed his sword from his back and turned into his smaller skeletal form. Her village was being attacked by some very high-level demons, but she was the only one who thought to stop them. She even led them away from the village. I think she has the makings of not only a great hero, but a great king. Well, Midoriya, it seems you come very highly recommended. Nedzu looked at her as she blushed a bright red again as she stared at her knees. So, I take it you were informed of the situation by His Majesty in full, but I want to make sure before you dive into this treacherous job. Are you willing to take on the sword one for all, that enhances quirks and lets you use it to your fullest? Are you ready to become king of the world? Yes. Izuku looked up at the principal with serious eyes. I've had a month to think it over, and now I can't imagine looking for any other job other than this. I want to help people with a bright smile on my face like His Majesty. And I want people to be reassured when I step onto the scene, to know everything is going to be all right. She clenched her fists tightly on her knees. I want to drive the demons back to the Badlands they came from, and save this world. Very well. The mouse smiled at her before taking a sip of tea from his mug. Well then, Your Majesty. He looked to All Might now, before gesturing to the table off to the side. The replacement blade for One for All is ready for you. It will allow you to use the power your being still has stored within you, an enhancement sword if you will. All Might stood up and walked towards the table. Though you won't be able to hold that muscle form of yours for very long with this, I recommend you stay at the guild with us. I assume Midoriya here has applied for a membership. He looked to her again and she nodded excitedly. So, until she becomes a proper heir to the throne, I think this is the best solution. I agree. All Might picked up the sword and returned to his large muscle form. Until she is ready, I will stay here at the guild. He looked back at the principal with a wide grin. Now, could you excuse us? I would like a moment alone with Midoriya, so that I can do this properly. Yes, of course. Nezu got up from his couch and smiled at Izuku, who stood up. Midoriya, I look forward to see how you grow and wield One for All. He nodded to her, before exiting the room. Izuku looked up at All Might nervously as he picked up One for All. Midoriya, this is a process only the king and the heir of One for All are allowed to witness. All Might looked at her seriously, and she swallowed her nerves and nodded her head. I would like it if you kept this whole thing a secret. Do not let others know that you are the wielder of One for All, or you might come to find trouble. Do you swear to keep that promise? I swear. She bowed her head to him, before straightening back up again. She looked at the sword, as he drew it from its sheath. Then kneel. He looked down at her as she got down on one knee and looked up at him before bowing her head. As the king of the world, and wielder of One for All, he held the blade out and pointed it at her. He touched the tip to her right shoulder first. I bestow the legendary power of this sword upon you. He touched her left shoulder next. You will wield this sword for the masses, and use it to protect the innocent. He touched the tip to the top of her head, and Izuku felt her skin tingle. She looked at her hand and saw a soft golden glow. I, Yagi Toshinori, known widely as King All Might, bestow this sword One for All, unto you, Izuku Midoriya, the new wielder of One for All. Izuku looked up at All Might, seeing a grin on his face as he sheathed the sword, before kneeling in front of her. That's it? She asked curiously. A bit of theatrics. He told her and held the sword out to her. Take the handle and pull it out, he told her as her hands took the large blade in them. She felt how heavy it was, and nervously took the handle in her gloved hand. She activated her power as she stood up, and noticed that her hand was giving off a golden glow as she pulled on the handle. Izuku could feel the blade quivering in the sheath in her hands. It began to glow gold, before the light got brighter and blinded her. My, a sword fit for a king. Huh. She opened her eyes after a moment, and saw the sword had shrunk. Instead of a giant claymore, it was now a broadsword. She fully pulled it out of the sheath, and looked at it with wide eyes. It's so cool. She gripped it tightly and felt the warmth of power in her body. The blade started to glow golden and she looked it over. The sword can only be passed to another if the wielder wishes for it. All Might stood up and grinned at her brightly. It cannot be taken from you by force, but it can be given to you by force. This is awesome, she shouted as she looked it over, before looking up at All Might. Thank you, Your Majesty. Just call me All Might, the man laughed at her loudly. Now I think you should run along and get some rest after our journey. Thank you. Izuku sheathed the sword and slung it around her body so it settled on her back. She pushed her hair out her face and All Might looked at her with surprise as he noticed the ruby glint off her right ear, hidden under some curly locks. Midoriya, that boy from your childhood. She looked up at All Might as he spoke nervously. Did he give you that earring? Yeah. Izuku smiled brightly up at him. It's so we'd be friends forever, which is why I need to find him. She beamed happily. I'm going to finally take a bath now. I'll see you later, All Might. She ran off out of the room, leaving a stunned king behind her. She took off at a run to head towards the building she was heading to earlier. She felt the sword bounce on her back with her yellow bag, and she beamed happily. Wow, I can't wait to try this sword out, she said excitedly as she came up to the lodging building. She saw 1A written across the building made of stone, and she walked up to the door and opened it up. Midoriya, Uraraka called out from a sofa and Izuku looked over at her nervously as she looked around the floor she was on. It was like a mansion. She could see a large kitchen off to the side, and she looked back at some stairs that lead off to the floors above them. Isn't this amazing? I've never seen a building so big. I also found our rooms are on the same floor. This is huge. Izuku's eyes were wide as she approached her new friend. Right, so crazy. Uraraka swung her arms around wildly. Izuku laughed a bit before she ruffled her hair. I really want to take a bath, I'm going to go do that. She told Uraraka with a grin. Well, go put your stuff down in your room. The baths are over there. The girl pointed to a couple of doors beside each other. I think I'll take one too. The girl got up and they went upstairs, laughing happily. Izuku turned to look at a door and pushed it open to see a fair-sized room. There was a comfy-looking bed off to the side and a desk. She walked over to it and placed her bag and sword on top of it, before she opened up some of the drawers. She beamed happily at the sight of some towels and pulled a couple out before she threw her clothes into it. She ruffled around in them, pulling out a pair of clean trousers, a clean white shirt and clean vest. She grabbed a hairbrush and stepped out of her room with her items. Did you see how comfy those beds looked? Uraraka shouted happily at her as she stepped out of her room with an armful of her own things. The girls walked downstairs to head to the baths. I can't wait to sleep in a bed, there's no inns in the mountains, so I've been sleeping on nothing but rocks. Izuku said with a happy sigh as they entered the woman's bath. Her mouth dropped open as she saw the wash basins and a big bath with steaming hot water. Wow, I've never seen a bath so large. Me either, Uraraka said happily as they got undressed. Izuku sat down on a stool to take her hair out of the messy braids she had wrapped around her head. Uraraka looked over at her as she started washing herself and Izuku saw her jaw drop open as Izuku let her long green curls fall around her shoulders down to the middle of her back. Oh my god, your hair is so long, and the color is so pretty. How did you hide that much hair? My mother taught me how to tight crown braids. Izuku laughed as she began scrubbing the week's worth of dirt and grime off her skin. She then soaked her hair and began washing that as well. You look so pretty with your hair down. You should wear it like that more often. Uraraka told her as the girls finished washing themselves before getting into the hot bath to soak. This is heaven, Uraraka sighed out as she sunk into the steaming water. Yeah, Izuku agreed with a happy sigh as she soaked her sore muscles in the water. It feels good to be fully clean again, inns have terrible baths. She said with a sigh. Hey, I like your earring. Izuku looked over at her with surprise as Uraraka beamed at her. It's so pretty. But why do you only have one? Oh, my friend gave it to me before he left. Izuku said with a warm smile as she blushed a bit. So that we would meet again one day, and be friends forever. The mountain tribe boy? Uraraka asked with a nervous look and Izuku looked at her with a bright grin. Yeah, it's a sign of our friendship. She said happily and Uraraka looked away from the bright shining face, letting out a sigh. Well, that's pretty sweet. Uraraka turned to look back at her friend. Hey, since I think we're going to be good friends too, can I call you Izuchan? Sure. Izuku sat up with an even brighter smile. See, can I call you Ochachan? Of course. Uraraka cried out and hugged the other girl. I've only ever had one friend before, this is so exciting. Izuku said with a bright happy smile as they got out of the hot water. We're going to be friends forever too. Uraraka shouted at her with tears in her eyes and Izuku let out a small laugh as they dried themselves off and got dressed. Izuku stepped out into the common room with her, brushing her long hair when Iida came bursting into the building, still wearing his armor. Iida, what's up? I've been informed. He stopped as he saw Izuku brushing her long hair and shock crossed his face. You really are a girl. Izuku paled a bit and sweated nervously. Yes I am. She looked down at her boyish clothes and let out a sigh. Did you come here with something to say? Oh yes. Iida waved his arms around as he walked over to them. I was just informed by midnight that we have our first mission already, and we need to leave as soon as we're ready. Ow. Izuku groaned out at the thought of not being able to sleep in the bed upstairs. Alright, she sighed out as she and Uraraka frowned. Let me go get my things. I will wait here. Iida saluted to the girls as they ran upstairs to grab their items. Izuku quickly tied her hair up into a crown braid again, and looked at it in the mirror. She sighed out as she noted that she really did look like a young boy, her curls hiding the braid. She shrugged her shoulders, before she pulled her sword around her shoulders and grabbed her bag after emptying out some clothes from it. She went back downstairs to meet the others in the common room. So what's this mission that's so important? Uraraka asked, looking tired already. We only just arrived here, why would they send us? It's this. Iida held up a scroll and unfurled it. It says we are to head back out into the mountain region and search for the mountain tribe. The guild is lacking in beginner heroes, so we are to reach out to them in hopes they'll join up with us, as well as anyone else we meet on our way. Mountain tribe. Izuku's eyes lit up with excitement. This is great. Uraraka looked to Izuku with a bright grin. Maybe you'll get to meet your friend sooner rather than later. Yes. Izuku clenched her fists and grinned at her new friends. This is great. She tore off towards the door. "Let's get going," she shouted before Iida reached out a hand and grabbed her by the back of her bag. "We should grab some rations from the shops and make sure we are prepared before we take off on our journey," he informed her, and Izuku laughed nervously. "You're right, let's go do that before we leave," Izuku said with a grin as the small group left their lodgings. They headed to the plaza where the shops were, and she looked around at all the items and opened up a pouch on her hip to look at her gold coins. She should have enough for food. "I will get us some healing potions," Iida said with a grin as he stepped up beside her at a booth. He put some gold on the counter, and the shopkeeper with sheep horns handed him several bottles of green liquid. "In case we encounter some trouble, these should help us with minor wounds," he said as he collected them. "Here," Izuku opened up her bag and he put them inside carefully. "Let's get ourselves some rations too," she said as they moved off to a booth that had dried meats and a selection of produce. The group bought enough for a few days. "We'll probably have to hunt when we run low." "Hunt?" Uraraka looked at Izuku nervously. "I've never done that before." "I have," Izuku smiled at her two friends. "I also have some knowledge of herbs in case we run low on potions." "The people from the forest are very knowledgeable," Iida said with a smile as they headed towards the gates. "I guess." Izuku looked up at the gate as they were let out. "We don't have room to grow crops like the people in the plains, so we forage for fruit and other things from the forest." "You're so amazing, Izuchan," Uraraka said with a bright grin as the group headed only the road back towards the mountains. "Haha, not really." Izuku laughed as she scratched her cheek and looked back at the guild. She wondered if maybe she should have told the king she was leaving, but supposed someone would inform him. She let out a sigh before she turned to the mountainous region before them. "From what I know, the mountain tribe live in the forested parts on the mountains." She looked out at the pointy peaks, so they're probably in that direction. She pointed northeast to some smaller mountains where they could see trees growing up the slopes. "We should try there first, and search the trees." "Did you learn all this from your friend?" Iida asked as the group made their way along the road. "Yeah," she smiled brightly before she reached into a pocket on her bag and pulled out a worn notebook. "He told me lots of things, he's very smart," she said as she flipped it open and the other two looked at her extensive notes. "I'd say you're the smart one, recording all that." Uraraka beamed at her as they walked. "Yes, knowledge of the mountain tribe is extremely rare," Iida said with a grin. "By the way, what is the nature of your quirk?" "Oh," Izuku scratched her cheek for a moment before holding up her gloved fist. "It's strength," she said as her fist glowed a faint golden color. She was a bit shocked to see it was no longer a green glow, and it crackled a bit with some red electricity. "It's nothing special," she said as she lowered her hand. "I'd say that's an amazing quirk," Uraraka said happily as she held up her staff. "I can make things float, like how I did in the mountains earlier." She twirled her staff around. "But if I do too much or use it for too long I get sick," she said with a laugh. "Mine allows me to run faster than any horse," Iida said proudly as they walked. "My armor is designed to help me use my quirk with precious metals." They looked at Izuku as she started scribbling in her notebook. Those are so amazing," she said happily as she wrote the notes down. "Man, I wonder what kind of quirks the mountain tribe has too. I can't wait." Izuku looked up at the mountains, beaming brightly. The other two let out laughs as they saw her excitement and she laughed with them. The sun started setting as they entered the forested parts of the mountain range, and Izuku looked back worriedly. "We should find somewhere safe to camp," Iida said from ahead of them as they pushed through the foliage, no longer on a set path. "Demons like darker places," Izuku told them both as they stepped over a fallen tree. "Especially forested areas. We are going to need someone to keep watch while we rest," she said as she looked around at their surroundings. "Have you seen demons before?" Uraraka asked, looking back at her nervously. "They were pretty rampant where I come from." Izuku sighed as she pushed a bush out of her way. "I lived close to the Badlands. I've defeated some of them before." "That's amazing." Iida looked back at her with wide eyes. "They're not as rampant in the central region. To have experienced battle with demons before is pretty rare where we come from. It's pretty common in my village." Izuku laughed nervously as they walked. "And in the mountains. So we should be very careful. We're a good distance away from the Badlands, but they might still be lurking around here somewhere." At least we have someone experienced with us. Uraraka hopped up over a large bush and smiled. You're going to be one cool hero someday. I hope so. Izuku smiled as they continued on their makeshift path through the woods. She looked to the left and spotted a sloping path. Let's head up that way, she said as she walked towards it and began climbing. If we have some higher ground we'll be a bit safer than down in this valley. She looked back at her friends as they followed after her. They made their way up the slope through the trees and she looked out to the valley, seeing the vast forest around them. I'd say we have about a day or so before we get anywhere close to a mountain tribe settlement, she continued to push upwards. Though some live close to the edges of the mountains, this might be too close. Truly a lifesaver, Iida shouted with pride. When they found themselves some flat ground, the group made a fire before settling down for the night. As they slept they took turns watching over the group while the others slept. Izuku scribbled in her notebook as she took up her watch, and looked out at the dark forest below. She gripped her pencil tightly in her hands, hoping with all her being that she'd get to meet her friend. The next day, the group pushed on through the mountain forest, Izuku in the lead. The other two huffed out behind her as she climbed over fallen trees and pushed through bushes with ease. You're going so fast, Uraraka cried out behind her and Izuku looked back at her friends and laughed nervously. Sorry, but we need to find somewhere to camp for the night again. She looked up at the sky above them, seeing the sun heading into the west. I'm just glad we haven't run into any trouble yet. Who knew being a hero would involve so much walking? Uraraka groaned out as she hopped over a fallen tree and Iida caught her from stumbling. The better part of being a hero is journeying to far-off parts of the world, helping others. Iida told the girl who let out a huff. Most of it will be spent walking or on horseback. I should have gotten a horse. Uraraka groaned out. Ah. Izuku stopped near the edge of a cliff and the others looked at her. She was looking up at a cliff side, where the group spotted a large white horse. Wow, ask and you shall receive, Uraraka said in awe before she began running off towards the horse. Wait, that might belong to someone, Izuku cried out as she ran after her friend. From what she could tell the horse looked far too clean to be a wild steed. Ochachan, wait up, she called out as they ran up the sloping cliff over the valley. She felt something shift under her foot, before it slipped out from under her. She cried out as she felt her body plummet down the slope. Midoriya, Iida called out as he reached out to grab her hand but she went tumbling down. Izuchan, Uraraka cried out, turning to look at the other girl as she tried to grab hold of a rock to stop herself. She was heading pretty fast into a tree line. Wah, how'd I fall down so many cliffs? She cried out as she tumbled, before her eyes caught the flash of sparkling white and blue. She heard a crackling sound, and all of a sudden a curve of ice was in her path. She tumbled in it, and up the curve, before she dropped back down to a stop on the cold ice. Woo, where did that come from? Izuku pushed herself up as she looked up at the ice, and then up the slope. She saw her friends looking towards the cliff with the horse on it, and she noticed a trail of ice coming from it towards her. Are you all right? A cool voice called out to her, and her eyes widened as she saw a boy with white and red hair standing next to the horse. His eyes were different colors, teal and gray. He had a scar on the left side of his face, and wore a royal blue vest over a clean white shirt, with gray trousers. She noticed a sword in his hand that he had stabbed into the ground where the ice came from. I'm okay. Izuku shouted up at the others and she pushed herself up off the ground before she began trudging up the slope carefully. Just, pretty dirty, she groaned out as Iida pulled her back up onto the slope they were climbing. Sorry about that, it's what I was worried Uraraka was going to do, but then I ended up falling, she laughed out as Uraraka came running back to her. Izuchan, your hair got all messed up again, she said with a worried look on her face. Are you sure you're alright? You've scraped your cheek. I'm good, these are minor wounds. Izuku waved her hands at her friends nervously as they looked her over. They looked up as the boy who saved her walked towards them, his horse trotting behind him. Thanks for saving me. My name's Izuku Midoriya. She bowed to the boy as he stepped up to them. Shoto Todoroki. He spoke to the group as the others introduced themselves. What are you doing out here in the mountains? He asked them curiously and Izuku straightened back up and dug around in her pockets. We're from the UA Guild, she said with a grin as she held up the metal plate that proved their membership. We're here to locate the mountain tribe and recruit heroes. Ah, the boy named Todoroki glanced at the plate before looking at the others. Todoroki. I've heard that name before. Iida said with a thoughtful look. So have I. Uraraka said as she tapped her finger on her chin in thought. Todo, Roki. Izuku looked down for a second, before her eyes widened in realization. Prince Todoroki from the forest region. Whaaaaat. The other two shouted in surprise, but the boy just gave them cool looks as they all nervously shouted. Lord Endeavor's son. Iida asked in shock, and Todoroki shot him a dark look. Unfortunately. The boy said with a sigh, looking away from them all. What are you doing all the way out here? Izuku asked nervously as he turned to look back at them all. I was on my way to the Yue Guild. He said coolly as he looked at them all. Well, you should join us. Uraraka said with a nervous smile. Maybe you can help us with the mountain tribe. Doubtful. But I suppose traveling in a group wouldn't hurt. You look like you lot might have a bit of trouble. Haha. Izuku smiled nervously at him before he turned to look out at the valley forest. I saw some firelight in that direction the other night. He pointed out towards the other mountain. I suppose what you're looking for might be over there. Great. Izuku shouted happily, and she looked down the slope. Let's make our way that way then. She shouted as she analyzed the slope she recently rolled down, before she saw a bit of an easier angle. She ran up the hill towards it, before looking back at the group. Let's go this way, she shouted at them, waving as they followed her, before she leapt off the steady path and dug her heels into the ground. Izuchan, Uraraka cried out as they ran to watch her. She crouched down as she slid down the slope's edge, and put a hand out to balance herself as she went. Wow, Izuchan is so cool. Indeed. Iida adjusted his glasses, before they looked to Todoroki, who grabbed the reins of his horse. He touched his sword to the ground, and took off after the green-haired girl. The other two were surprised to see the horse seemed used to travel on slick ice as he glided down after Izuku. I think we're being left behind. Let's go, Uraraka shouted as she took off after them with Iida. Izuku turned her head to look up the slope as she made it to the bottom, and smiled as she saw Todoroki glide to the flat land after her. He sheathed his sword, and the horse gave a snort as it dug its hooves into the dirt it preferred. Your quirk is so cool, Izuku told the boy excitedly as she pulled out her notebook and began scribbling in it. How fascinating, but, if you're Lord Endeavor's son, how come you don't have a fire quirk? She looked at him curiously, and he shot a cold look at her. I prefer not to use it, he said coolly as he looked away from her while the other two came sliding in. We should hurry and find a place to camp for the night. I don't think we'll be able to make it to their settlement today, Izuku said with a sigh as they traveled through the woods. She looked around at the dense forest that surrounded them. I don't like the thought of being in a valley, but we'll have to make do. We should also be careful as we approach the tribe. They don't take too kindly to people from outside the mountains. Sounds scary, Uraraka said with a shiver as they walked. Then why send us? Probably because you don't look that scary or threatening, Todoroki told them all, and the group paled a bit at his comment. As night started to fall, they found a tree to camp under for the night, and Izuku gathered up some wood to make a fire. She went to light it but looked up as Todoroki drew a sword with his left hand. Here, he said with a sigh as he touched the tip of it to the wood and it caught flame. Wow, Izuku cried out in awe and looked up at him. Why, you can use ice and fire. That's so amazing. It's nothing, he said with a sigh as he sat down. The forest started to grow darker and darker. Iida took the first watch while the other three slept, before he woke Izuku up. She rubbed her tired eyes as she watched her friend settle down for some rest, and let out a sigh. She looked around at the woods, before grabbed for her water flask on her hip. She opened it up, and frowned as she saw it was empty. Ochachan. She shook her friend away and she looked up at her, yawning. I need to grab some water. Can you take watch for a few minutes? Sure, Uraraka said with a sleep smile, and Izuku grinned back at her as she grabbed her sword off the ground and slung it around her shoulder. She stepped out into the dark woods, and could hear the soft trickling sound of a stream nearby. She dug around her pocket for a moment, looking for the glowstone she had bought before they left Yue, and pulled it out. The faint yellow light lit up enough of her path, and she looked around for the stream. She smiled brightly as she came across it, and knelt down to fill her flask. There. This should be good. She took a drink with her hands, before running them through her messy hair. Ugh, I sure miss a bed. She sighed out as she stood back up. She turned to head back, before she heard a rustling in the trees ahead of her. She stopped, and looked around with wide eyes as she reached for her sword. She listened intently for more rustling, but heard nothing. Must have been the wind, she said to herself before she let go of her sword. She started walking again, before she tripped on a rock. She groaned out as she dropped her glowstone, and it tumbled out of sight into bushes. Great. She pushed herself up and walked over to the bushes she saw it roll off into. I won't be able to find my way back without Kaya. Izuku looked up as she heard Uraraka's scream of horror and felt her face pale. She pushed through the bush to run back, but felt her ankle snag around something. She cried out in surprise as she fell forwards, before she saw a glint of metal in the moonlight. Her eyes widened as strong rope wrapped around her in a tangle, before she was yanked up into the air by the one around her ankle. What the heck? She cried out, as she struggled with the thick rope that bound her arms to her side and chest. She looked up at her feet as she dangled from a tree branch and groaned as she tried to reach her pockets with her hands. She had shoved her gloves in them, which she cursed about as she couldn't seem to wiggle enough to get them out. What do we have here? A growling deep voice called out and her eyes widened in fear as she turned her head to look at the trees where it came from. I was hoping for rabbit. But I guess this is the same. Someone stepped out of the dark trees and the moonlight lit up the figure. She looked at them. Their body was cloaked in a red cape with fur around the collar, but what scared her was the skull for the head. It looked like a smaller dragon's skull, decorated with feathers and colorful paints. She saw glowing red eyes through the sockets of the skull, and she shivered in horror. Demon! She shouted loudly as she tried to free herself. Shit! She groaned as the ropes seemed to tighten around her. Not a demon, the person said with a growl, and a hand reached out from the cloak as he walked closer to her. She ground her teeth together as he approached and saw his arm was decorated with many colorful bracelets, as well as some orange arm bands and metal plates. The hand tilted the skull up a bit so she could see a toothy grin that looked hungry. But considering you're in my territory, I guess you could call me one. Mountain Tribe. Izuku looked up at him as he let go of the skull so it covered his face fully once more. Correct, he said in a deep growl and she felt her chest tighten.